Good afternoon, guys. Today we're gonna have here one more webinar with our professor André, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys. I just want to remember you that this webinar is promoted by Internationalization at Home, an extension project from UFMG, and it's a project coordinated by Professor André, who's gonna deliver today's lecture or presentation. Just to inform you guys, I have here the formation of Professor André, and I'm gonna read it for you guys. Professor André Luiz Mendes Athayde has a PhD in administration from University of Brasília with a doctoral internship at the University of Tampa, United States, CAPS scholarship holder, a master's degree in administration from the Federal University of Viçosa, graduation in administration from the St. Augustine Institute, and a graduation in English from the Montes Claros State University, Unimontes. And also he has a complementary studies in advanced English at Middle Tennessee State University in Nashville, United States, as well in as well as in supply chain management at Novo Nordisk in Copenhagen, Denmark, and he has presented scientific papers at University of Oxford in England and at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Costa Rica. Furthermore, he is a winner of the prize for the best article in the field of the organizational studies in a national event at the University of São Paulo. And lastly, he is an adjunct professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, UFMG, Montes Claros campus. So welcome, Professor, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us. If you want to present some more information about you, project it or share, better saying, share your slides, feel free. The word is with you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you guys for participating. This is an opportunity for us to practice our English, and not only that, but reflecting, talk about important points related to internationalization, related to administration. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about cross-cultural research or cross-cultural studies. I'm going to present here some slides for you to follow better my presentation. Just a sec. So, as I said, today's presentation is focused on cross-cultural studies or cross-cultural research. And this is a topic that has caught my interest over the last years. And given the fact that our people here this afternoon with different backgrounds, I'm not going to go too deep into the subject, but I hope you enjoy it. And before we talk, guys, about cross-cultural studies or cross-cultural research, we have to learn, we have to remember what culture means. What is the meaning of culture? What does it mean? What does culture mean? Defining culture, guys, is very hard because there's a high number of different definitions, a high number of different conceptualizations. Just for you to have an idea, this book was published by these authors in 1952, a long time ago, a book entitled Culture, a Critical Review of Concepts and Definitions. So, a book that was published in 1952, these authors identified 154 different definitions of culture. And these definitions presented in the book ranged from a learned behavior to ideas in the mind, a psychic defense mechanism. So, different definitions. Culture is a learned behavior, cultures are ideas in the mind, culture is a psychic defense mechanism. And more recently, in 2006, this book was published by these authors, a book entitled Redefining Culture, Perspectives Across the Disciplines. And these authors, guys, identified 300 different definitions of culture. And I believe that nowadays, probably there are more than that, right? So it is really hard to define cultures. Many different knowledge fields investigate culture in different levels with different perspectives. But I decided to bring here for our reflection this afternoon some of the concepts that are considered the most known or the classic uh, concepts, the classic conceptualizations, especially from two different knowledge fields that have most dedicated their time to investigate cultures. First, anthropology. Anthropology was the first knowledge field that started studying culture, and psychology. So the concepts that I brought here for our reflection are especially brought up by anthropologists and psychologists. The first concept that I brought was proposed by Edward Tyler. He was a British anthropologist. And probably if you have ever studied culture once in your life, in elementary school or high school, or even in your graduation, probably you've heard a definition close to this one. This definition from Edward Tyler is considered the classic or the original concept of culture. Edward Tyler, guys, says that culture is that complex whole, that group, which includes a lot of things. Culture includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So, culture is a group comprised of many elements. Examples of these elements are languages, values, attitudes, behaviors, law, customs, habits, morals, and all these other elements cited here by Edward Tyler. Another concept that I'd like to share with you this afternoon was brought up by a Dutch cross-cultural psychologist who passed away a few years ago in 2020. His name was Gert Hofstede. Hofstede is one of the most known, one of the most popular cross-cultural psychologists in the world. And he proposed a definition for culture, which is very popular. He says that culture is the collective programming of the mind. Culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes members of one group or category of people from another group, from another category of people. I like this concept, guys, because it deals with mind. I really believe that culture is intimately related to our minds, to the way we think about things, to what we value, to our thoughts, to our interpretations. So this is why basically I like this concept, and this is why basically this concept became very popular worldwide. The third concept of culture that I would like to share with you was brought up by a cross-cultural psychologist from the United Kingdom named Peter Smith. Peter Smith says that culture is the shared way by which individuals interpret what happens around them. Culture is the shared way by which individuals interpret around what happens around them. I like this concept also because it focuses on different interpretations that are shared among groups. So if we are part of the same culture, we share interpretations about what happens around us. Not all of them, of course, but we share many interpretations about what happens around us. He says, pay attention to this statement. He says that if two people agree that a particular gesture indicates sympathy rather than aggression, or if they agree that a particular gesture is beautiful and not ugly, they are interpreting the world around them in a similar way. If these similarities in interpretations are similar and are numerous, we can say that these two people share a culture. So Peter Smith, he focuses his understanding. Sorry, guys. He focuses his understanding on how we share information, how we share interpretations about what happens around us. Okay. Another concept that I would like to share with you was brought up by an American anthropologist from the Harvard University. He is considered the forerunners, one of the pioneers in the investigations about culture. His name was Clyde Kluckhouse, and he says, actually, this is not a concept itself, but it's a statement that helps us understand what culture means. He says, pay attention. He says that culture can be seen by society as equivalent to memory by individuals. Culture can be seen by society as equivalent to memory by individuals. So just for us to have a glimpse of what culture means, he's saying that what our memories represent to us individuals is what culture represents to society. This is a very interesting statement. And at last, I would like to share with you the last concept of culture was brought up by this Greek cross-cultural psychologist. He was a member of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychologists, and he passed away a few years ago in 2019. Triandis, Harry Triandis. He says that culture is a shared pattern, a shared standard of beliefs, attitudes, norms, and values. So he focuses on this concept on sharing patterns of beliefs, patterns, standards of attitudes, of values. This is also another very important concept, conceptualization of culture uh, in this knowledge field. But who studies culture? I brought here some definitions from, especially from anthropologists and from psychologists. But what are the areas, what are the knowledge fields that investigate culture besides anthropology, besides psychology? The term culture, guys, is typically used for tribes or ethnic groups, especially in anthropology. So we could say, we could infer that culture started to be investigated by anthropology, especially when it comes to investigating ethnic groups, tribes. But culture is also typically used by nations. We call them national cultures. When culture is investigated for nations, they will be called national cultures. And national cultures are an object investigated by political science, sociology, psychology, and even administration. And culture can also be used typically for organizations. When we talk about cultures of organizations, they are normally called organizational cultures. And organizational cultures are normally studied by sociology and administration. Administration, for instance, really focuses its attention on organizational cultures, how people, how employees behave within the organizational scenarios, within companies, right? But we could say that culture is a term that is also typically used for genders, for generations, for social classes, and even for families. Okay, this is my family culture. I don't know if you've ever heard somebody saying something like that. But the most important thing that I would like you to remember is that culture is always a collective phenomenon. Culture is always a collective phenomenon. No individual has a culture by his own, by herself, by himself. Culture is always a collective phenomenon. This is an important and basic point. And how in practice, how do we study cultures? We just saw, guys, that culture is a very complex thing. It's a very complex term. It's a very complex construct. We just saw the concept brought by Edward Tyler, the British anthropologist. He said that culture is comprised of knowledge, languages, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, morals, law. So many things comprise a culture. So how could we investigate a culture, a variable that is so complex? Isn't culture too broad for scientific use? How could we study culture in science? Because of this complexity, these authors, they proposed an expression, they proposed a practice named unpacking the culture. They say that if we need to investigate a culture, we need to unpack it. What does it mean to unpack a culture? It means, guys, to isolate cultural elements of the culture to be used as research variables. To unpack the culture means to isolate cultural elements. For instance, languages, values, attitudes, behaviors, habits, norms, morals. What do they mean by that? In other words, they're saying, okay, if you want to investigate, if you want to explore, if you want to develop a study on a specific culture, it's better if you choose one or a few elements of this culture and investigate these variables. So let's say that I want to investigate, I want to develop a research about the Brazilian culture. It's much easier for me to pick up, to choose one of these elements or a few elements. Okay, I'm gonna pick up, I'm gonna choose behaviors. I wanna investigate the Brazilian culture based on Brazilian behaviors. That's gonna be my focus. So that's what these authors are suggesting. And that's what is done in scientific research that investigates culture. Just one or a few elements of culture are investigated at a time because culture, as we just saw, is something very complex. It's something very complex that there are more than 300 different definitions. So it would be unlikely, it would be almost impossible for us to investigate a culture in one single study and cover all these varieties of elements that we just saw. Okay, so basically that's how cultural studies are done. At this point, guys, it is very important for us to differentiate cultural research from cross-cultural research. You have to understand the main difference between cultural studies and cross-cultural studies, and it's very easy to understand. Take a look. Cultural research is focused on exploring features, characteristics of a culture. So a cultural study or cultural research picks up, chooses one culture to be investigated, and tries to explore different features, different characteristics of this specific culture. On the other hand, cross-cultural research or cross-cultural studies, they are focused on exploring differences between cultures. They develop comparisons between different groups. They compare two or more groups, two or more cultures, okay? They can compare two or more subcultures. They can compare two or more organizational cultures. They can compare two or more national cultures, okay? Or regional cultures, regardless of the cultural level. So they are always comparing different groups, two or more groups. I suppose that you have already heard of a Brazilian researcher named Darcy Ribeiro. For those who don't know, Darcy Ribeiro was interested in investigating the culture of Indians in the Amazon forest primarily. So I ask you, if Darcy Ribeiro was focused on exploring the features, the characteristics of the culture of Indians in the Amazon rainforest, I ask you, was Darcy Ribeiro a cultural researcher or a cross-cultural researcher? What do you think? Feel free to participate. Just one of you guys, unmute your microphone and try to answer this question. Was Darcy Ribeiro a cultural researcher, in your opinion, or a cross-cultural researcher?
I think it was a cross-cultural researcher because the Indians groups they have beliefs. What more? Maybe I don't know language different between them.
Okay. Actually, guys, pay special attention to what I'm going to say. Darcy Ribeiro, he was focused on exploring the language and behaviors and attitudes of Indians in the Amazon forest, but he was not deliberately comparing the culture of Indians in the Amazon forest with other groups. Indirectly, of course, he was somehow comparing their culture with ours. Okay? Every time that a cultural research, not a cross-cultural research, but every time that a cultural researcher investigates characteristics of a specific culture, he is focused, he is interested in the characteristic of that culture. And of course, that naturally he will somehow compare to his own culture. But his main focus, that's what we have to pay attention to, was investigating characteristics. When he went to the Amazon forest, he didn't have the purpose previously, okay, I'm going to compare their culture with the culture from other region or their culture with the typical Brazilian culture. No, he was interested in investigating cultures, characteristics, elements of the culture of those tribes. Okay, so accurately, we could say that Darcy Ribeiro was a cultural researcher and not a cross-cultural researcher. Okay, typically, I'm talking about what is typical. Okay, maybe he developed an investigation that I haven't read so far. Maybe he's published a book that I haven't had read so far, and he deliberately compared two or more cultures. But his main work is based on investigations of elements of the culture of Indians in the Amazon forest. Okay. Another question for you guys. Take a look at this article. I I'm showing here for you just the title of the article, of the paper, of a scientific paper, and the beginning of the abstract section. So let's read the title. The title of the research is Compared Analysis of the School Day in European Union Countries. Compared Analysis of the School Day in European Union countries. I'm going to read just for us, just to make it easier for us, the beginning of the abstract section. Abstract. This article aims to analyze the school days in European Union countries, systematizing similarities and differences between education systems. The compared analysis involved 15 member countries, and focused on the descriptive and comparative phases of the classical and so on. So I ask you guys, based on this title and based on what is written at the beginning of the abstract section, could we consider this article a cross-cultural study? Yes, no, or why not?
And I think so. You can consider. But it's comparing between the schools, right?
Yes.
So I believe it's a cross-cultural study.
Okay. Who else besides Amanda would like to participate? Who agrees or who disagrees with Amanda and why?
I'm gonna try and say that I agree because not only because it's a compare analysis of the school day or analysis of the schools, but it is the analysis of schools in European Union countries. So I think it is cross-cultural study.
Okay, thanks, Luis. Guys, what I would like to teach here is that I'm sure you're going to understand. When you compare two or more countries, not necessarily it means that this is a cross-cultural study. Why am I saying that? For a study to be considered a cross-cultural research, of course, you have to compare two or more groups, two or more countries, like in this case. But you have to make the discussion in light of culture. Culture must be involved. Okay? Pay special attention to the example I'm going to give you. Let's say that I'm comparing Latin American countries. Okay, I'm comparing 4 Latin American countries. 4. And I'm comparing the Human Development Index in these 4 countries. And I can prepare an investigation and publish this paper comparing these 4 countries with respect to differences regarding their respective human development index, and not talk about culture at all. So what I want you to understand is that for a cross-cultural study to be considered a cross-cultural study, a cross-cultural investigation, a cross-cultural research, I have to compare 2 or more groups, 2 or more countries in this case, and I have to discuss it in light of culture. For example, the possible influence of culture on this or that. In this case, maybe this could even be a cross-cultural study, but based on this information that I'm presenting here to you in this slide presentation, we cannot see culture being debated here, not even indirectly. Actually, what they are doing, what the authors are doing, they are comparing the school day in different European Union countries. 15 members, 15 countries, members of the European Union, and they are comparing the school day. For example, how much time children spend on each at school on each of these. Am I talking about the possible influence of their national culture on how much time, for instance, children spend in school? No. So what I would like to show you is that for a cross-cultural study to be considered a cross-cultural study, a cross-cultural research, the discussion must be made, must be elaborated in light of culture. But now take a look at this article. Let's read the title. Online pro-social behavior predicts well-being in different cultures. A daily diary study of Facebook users. Online pro-social behavior predicts well-being in different cultures. A daily diary study of Facebook users. Let's read just the beginning of the abstract section. Abstract. Almost 2 billion people use Facebook every day. But relatively few studies have examined the ways that culture shapes its use and in turn its associations with well-being. Our one-week daily diary study sought to extend this literature by comparing pro-social uses of Facebook in a collectivist culture, Thailand, and in an individualist culture, Canada. So based on this information that I just read, could we consider this article a cross-cultural study? Why or why not? Yes or no?
I'm gonna give it a try again. I think that now it really is a cross-cultural study because we have the term culture here and the comparison with two countries. The first one, Thailand, and the second one, Canada. So we have the comparison related to Facebook and the topic individualism, for example.
Perfect. Here, in this case, guys, indeed, we can say that this study is a cross-cultural study, that this research is a cross-cultural study. Why? First, we are comparing two or more groups, in this case, two or more countries, Thailand and Canada. But I'm not just talking about Facebook use. For example, how much time do Canadians and people from Thailand spend on Facebook? I'm not just talking about that. Actually, I'm talking about these differences between Facebook use in these two countries, between these two countries, in light of culture. The abstract even says that Canada is an individualistic culture and that Thailand is considered a collectivist culture. They are bringing here two very common characteristics of culture debated, discussed in cross-cultural research, which is individualism versus collectivism. So basically, these guys here, they are investigating the possible influence of the individualist culture in Canada and the possible influence of a collectivist culture in Thailand on Facebook use. So in this case, we could say that this article indeed represents a cross-cultural study. So cross-cultural studies, guys, investigates differences no matter what subject between countries in light of culture. Okay, so culture always is present. Okay. A very important point I would like to share now with you, because this mistake is very much made among scientists that are not that do not know deeply about cross-cultural studies. Cross-cultural studies, guys, are not deterministic. What do I mean by that? I cannot say if I discuss a characteristic of the Brazilian culture. Probably you've already heard that the Brazilian culture is known worldwide as a collectivist culture, right? Brazilians are collective. Okay. But I cannot say that all Brazilians are collectivist. You may be an individualist person and you are Brazilian. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that we cannot determine that we cannot get to know some characteristics of a given culture and assume that everybody whoever member of this particular culture behave or interpret things around them the same way. This mistake, guys, is known in the international literature of cultural reductionism. Okay? When we think that characteristics of a culture are necessarily characteristics of individuals of that culture, we are making a mistake called cultural reductionism. You probably have heard also that the American culture is one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. You probably have heard that Americans really like to work, that they are considered workaholic, but I cannot assume that all Americans are individualist and workaholic. Okay? That's a basic understanding that we have to do, that we have to have. So cross-cultural studies, guys, consider what is typical in a culture, the patterns, the standards in a culture. Cross-cultural studies, guys, takes into account probability. And what do I mean by probability in this sense, in this case? Let's say that I want to randomly sample 100 Brazilians, okay? From all different regions. I'm not going to pick up Brazilians only from Minas Gerais. I'm going to pick up 100 Brazilians from different regions of Brazil. I cannot assume that these 100 individuals present the same characteristics of the Brazilian culture. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about here. We cannot make the mistake of cultural reductionism. Okay, when I say probability, it means that if I pick up 100 Brazilians, there will be a high probability of finding among these 100 that I chose, people who are collectivist, people who are indulgent, people who score high on power distance and many other cultural characteristics that I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So cross-cultural studies, guys, consider, acknowledge the existence of subcultures. So you have a big culture like a national culture, and you have many subcultures depending on the region, for instance, right? In the US, for instance, you have two basic subcultures. You have the subcultures of the North part of the US, the so-called Northern culture and the Southern culture. Northern culture and the Southern culture. People from the states of the North part of the US and people from the states of the South part of the US. We could also say about Brazil, we have a different subculture in the northeastern part of Brazil, another subculture in the south of Brazil, and so on. So there are countries, guys, that are more homogeneous, like Japan. And there are countries that are more heterogeneous, like Brazil, Russia, China, the US. Did you notice that small countries tend to be homogeneous and big countries tend to be heterogeneous? So that happens. So the the bigger the country, the higher the probability of existence of subcultures. More heterogeneous this country will be. That's the sense behind this idea. So guys, think with me, stop to think with me. Okay, we wanna compare two or more countries. I cannot compare apples in Brazil, for instance, to oranges in the USA. I cannot compare cars in Brazil with bicycles in the United Kingdom. The basic understanding here that we have to have is that for me to compare two or more countries, I have to be able to measure something here and there also. So that's why Hofstede, this Dutch cross-cultural psychologist that I'm a big fan of, he passed away in 2020. He says that when we compare cultures, we need to consider characteristics that are universal. Is someone saying something?
I just muted here because I
Okay,
think
it was not a question.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. So guys, when we want to compare cultures, more than one culture, two or more cultures, we need to consider characteristics that are universal. I have to be able to measure one thing here and the same thing in the other countries that are going to be compared. Does it make sense to you? So Hofstede then in 1980, he proposed some cultural dimensions. He proposed some characteristics that are universal that could be measured here in Brazil and in any other country. And I'm going to give you just an idea about what each of these characteristics, each of these cultural dimensions mean. The first one is easy to understand, of course. The first cultural dimension that he proposed, guys, is named individualism, and it opposes to collectivism. Okay, so basically, guys, countries that score high on individualism, they are comprised of individuals who think of themselves and not about others primarily. Okay, they may even think about other people, but they primarily think about themselves. Okay, and individualism opposes to collectivism. So I can compare how individualistic or how collectivistic any country is. And that's what he did. When he presented these cultural characteristics, he investigated 40 countries simultaneously. The second cultural characteristic, guys, that he presented for us to compare two or more countries is called power distance. In a nutshell, in a few words, countries, pay attention, countries who score high on power distance, countries that have a high score on power distance, believe that inequalities in society are normal, that inequalities in society are okay, that inequalities in society is something natural, that we have to accept that some people, a few people, must have more power than other people. We have to accept that more people in society must have more privileges than other people. So countries with high score on power distance, they think that inequalities are okay, natural, common. Okay. The third cultural dimension is named masculinity. Masculinity, guys, is easy to explain. Countries that score high on masculinity, countries that score high on masculinity, they value competition. They are comprised of individuals who value competition, individuals who value success, individuals who value material success, individuals who value financial success, individuals who value power. Okay? These are masculine cultures. And countries that score low on masculinity, which are called feminine countries, they value quality of life and well-being. Quality of life and well-being. So on one hand, cultures that score high on masculinity, they value success, financial success, material success, competitiveness, competition, power. On the other hand, countries that score low on masculinity, countries that are high on femininity, they are worried, they value quality of life, they value well-being of society. Okay. The fourth dimension is called uncertainty avoidance. This dimension is easier to understand. Countries that score high on uncertainty avoidance, they are comprised of individuals who don't like or who try to avoid ambiguous situations, uncertain situations. They don't deal well with uncertain situations. They like stability. They value stability. Okay. They don't like to take risks, for instance. Countries that score high on uncertainty avoidance. These first four cultural dimensions were proposed by Hofstede in 1980, a long time ago. And these two others were proposed more recently in 1911. In 2011, sorry, in 2011. Long-term orientation. Long-term orientation, the name helps us because it explains itself. Countries that score high on long-term orientation are comprised of people who think about the future, okay, who try to prepare about the future, who acts today but thinks about the consequences in the future. And at last, indulgence. Indulgence, guys. Countries that score high on indulgence are comprised of individuals who have a hard time, who have trouble controlling their impulses. People who have control to domain themselves. People who have a hard time controlling their impulses for pleasure, for leisure, without thinking about the consequences. Indulgence opposes to restriction. So you may have cultures that are score high on indulgence, and cultures, on the other hand, that score high on restriction. Indulgence opposes to restriction. Okay, so countries that score high on indulgence, they are comprised of individuals who have a hard time controlling their impulses, especially impulses concerning pleasure and leisure. Okay, so he proposed these 6 cultural dimensions because all these 6 cultural dimensions can be measured in any country in the world. So based on these cultural dimensions, I can compare 2 or more countries, 2 or more national cultures, okay? By using these cultural dimensions, I'm not comparing apples with oranges somewhere else, okay? I'm comparing the same thing. So that's why these cultural dimensions have become very popular over the last decades. But I would like, before we finish this presentation, I would like to check out how much you know about cultures based on what you heard on the international media or based on what you read in books or scientific papers and so on. We have here 6 cultural dimensions, but I want you to pay special attention to the first one. Let's talk just about individualism because individualism is easier to understand, right? Individualism opposes to collectivism. Okay, so if we compare the Brazilian culture and the American culture, okay, who do you think, which country do you think is the most individualistic one, or which one is the most collectivist one? The score ranges from 0 to 100. That's the score that was proposed by Gerd Hofstede. But I just want to hear from you. Do you think that Brazilians are more collectivist or individualist compared to Americans before I show you the results?
I believe Brazil is more collectivist, but both it's really individualist, I think. But comparing both, I believe Brazil is more collectivist.
Okay, thank you, Amanda.
Good afternoon,
Guys,
André.
yes, André, please.
I think the contrary. I think Brazil is more individualist, and American, the U.S. is more collectivist.
Okay, thank you, André, for participating.
I think
Yep.
I agree with Amanda. I think USA it's more individualism, and then Brazil.
Okay. I'm going to show you here, guys, the results for all the 6 dimensions, okay, that Hofstadter presented. But let's focus our analysis, just to make it easier, on just individualism, okay? So the results are these. Brazil is highlighted here in orange for individualism, and the United States is highlighted in blue. So the United States, from 0 to 100, it scores 91 in individualism, and Brazil scores 38 in individualism. So the United States is considered one of the most individualistic countries in the world, and Brazil is considered one of the most collectivist countries in the world. I have been reflecting, guys, about this specific cultural dimension over the last years. I haven't written anything about that, or I haven't read anything about that. But in my opinion, the collectivism in Brazil is not a true collectivism, because Brazilians, they are not individualist because they think about other people, okay. But who is these other people? Who are these other people? Their friends and their family, their immediate family especially. So how can we say, this is André talking, okay? Just a hypothesis, just some reflections. How can we say that Brazilians are collectivist if they care normally only about their friends and their immediate families? Okay, I don't think about only myself. I'm a Brazilian. I don't think only about myself. I think about others, but I want privileges to my family. I want privileges to my friend. I want benefits to my immediate family, to my parents, to my brother and sisters, to my sons, to my children. Normally, that's what I see. I wonder why Brazilians really think about the well-being of the whole society. Because if that's not true, that's not a true collectivism. That's just a reflection of mine. But anyway, we can discuss it after the presentation. But based on Hofstede, Brazilians are more collectivist than the USA. I'm gonna do the same now with other countries, guys, and I would like to hear from you. Try to guess. Let's compare individualism versus collectivism between Brazil and Chinese in China. Do you think that Brazilians are more collectivist than Chinese or more individualist than Chinese? Please try to guess before I show you the results from Hofstede.
I think it is China. I don't know much why, but I think it's China.
China is more collectivist or individualist?
More collective.
Okay, okay. Okay, we have one guess. China is more collectivist. Who else wanna try to guess?
I agree with Novi. I believe China is more collective.
Okay. Who else? Everybody agrees with them too? Let's see
Yeah, I
the
agree
result.
too.
You agree too, Luis? Okay, let's see. Brazil is in orange, China is in blue. So with respect to individualism, Brazil scores 38. With respect to individualism, China scores 20. So we have to interpret the other way around, right? If China scores only 20 in individualism while Brazil scores 38, it means, in other words, that Chinese people are more collectivist than Brazilians. That's what has been proven by science. Okay. Another curiosity, let's talk about a country that is closer to us, Argentina. And let's keep talking, let's keep reflecting about individualism. Comparing Brazilians to Argentinians, do you think that Brazilians are more or less collectivist or individualist than Argentinians? Try to guess. I'm curious to hear your guesses.
I think that Argentina is more individualistic than Brazil.
Okay, we have a first guess by Luis. Argentina is more individualist than Brazil. Okay, we have a first guess. Who else want to participate?
I believe Brazil is more individualist because I have a friend that is in Argentina studying, and he says people there is really they are really cool. Actually, they helped him in the first day he was there, and I don't know. I think they are more collectivist.
Okay, let's see the result. Because it's in alphabetic order, Argentina now is in orange, okay? And Brazil is in blue. So Argentina scores 46 in individualism, and Brazil scores 38 in individualism. We could say that Argentinians are a little bit more individualistic than Brazilians, or the other way around, that Brazilians are more collectivistic than Argentinians. Latin American countries, guys, in a nutshell, they are very similar with respect to individualism. Latin American countries, with a few exceptions, they tend to be more collectivist. So most of the Latin American countries, if you check it out, if you check the results of the research developed by Hofstadter, you will see that most of them score less than 50 in individualism. But in this case, we can see that Brazil is more collectivist than Argentinians. And Amanda made me reflect about another thing. Investigating cultures, guys, is something very hard. And sometimes the impressions that we have about a culture is particular, okay? So maybe, let's say that I travel to a country, and in this country, the family who hosted me, they were very receptive, talkative, very warm. They treated me very well. And then I find another friend of mine who visited the US, and they say, oh my gosh, I hate that people, they are very individualistic. So sometimes the impressions that we have about a culture are based on one or a few experiences that we had there. So I don't know if you've ever heard about that. Sometimes a person travels to a country and spends 3 months there, let's say. And then he or she comes back to Brazil and says, oh, the Chinese culture is like this and like that. Wait a minute. You spend a short time there. You visit maybe one country or one region. You forgot that there are subcultures in that country. If you had visited another region, another state, maybe your impressions would be a little bit different. So we have to pay special attention. This is a precaution that we have to take into account when we are developing cultural studies or cross-cultural studies, okay? I'm not saying that this is the case of the friend of Amanda's, but she just reminded me of this very important point. What about Brazil and South Africa? Let's take a country from the African continent. Let's keep to reflect about individualism. Let's compare Brazil to South Africa. Do you think that Brazilians are more collectivist than South Africans or more individualist than South Africans? This one I'm really curious to hear from you because this comparison is not that common.
I think this one is really hard because it's South Africa, right?
Yes.
We have two problems. We have white people and black people. So I think this topic is really singular because of colonization, European mind, African mind. I think it's really hard to say if it is individualistic or collectivist. I don't have an answer.
Mhm.
I think South Africa is more individualist than Brazil.
Okay, André. Who
I
else?
agree. I agree with André because I don't know too much about South Africa, but I think Brazil is more uh, individualist than South Africa.
So,
I think, I'm sorry, Professor. I think South Africa is more individualist too, because if I'm not wrong, South Africa is one of the most rich countries in the continent of Africa. And comparing to between the other countries, and United States more rich than Brazil, and they were more individualist. Our Brazil right now is more rich than Argentina, and we are more individualists. So in South Africa, I'll go in this way too.
okay, I guess your guesses were correct. Let's take a look just on individualism. Brazil scores 38 on individualism and South Africa above 50, guys. They score high on individualism. But I agree with Luis that maybe colonization may have something to do with this specific cultural dimension, but Brazil is more collectivist than them. And one last example, guys. The last example. Let's talk about our colonizers. Let's compare Brazil and Portugal with respect to individualism. What do you think, guys? Brazilians are more or less collectivist than Portuguese people? You can guess and try to explain.
I believe Portugal is more individualist.
Portugal is more individualist. Okay.
I think also too. Um, the the talk about Amanda talked before is the same way. Portugal is more rich than Brazil, so I think Portugal is more individualism than Brazil.
Okay, 2 votes for Portugal as being the more individualistic compared to Brazil. Who else?
Maybe I would say that both of them are collectivist because of the topic religion, because both countries are Catholic, and it's typical from of of this religion to be more collectivist than individualistic, but with a little more maybe to individualism to Portugal.
Okay, let's see. Brazil in orange, Portugal in blue. Brazil scores 38 on individualism, and Portugal only 27 in individualism. So the conclusion is that Portuguese people are more collectivist than Brazilians. And this result catches my attention because the Brazilian culture is known worldwide as being collective, but I haven't heard people in the international media emphasizing the fact that Portuguese culture is collectivist, and they have a collectivism stronger than Brazilians. So the reasons behind that are many, right? At first, we may think that Portuguese people are more individualism because we may think about colonization, they try to explore us, and so on. But maybe I'm just hypothesizing, maybe our collectivism was somehow influenced by the collectivism of our colonizers, which were Portuguese people. But this result indeed catches our attention because even though the Brazilian culture is very popular for its collectivism, but it's even weaker than Portuguese. Okay, that was cool, guys. That was cool. Let's finalize our discussion this afternoon just with one last reflection. Why is it relevant to study culture? We are talking about cultural studies. We are talking about cross-cultural studies. And we have to understand, guys, that this is a two-way street. What do I mean by that? We individuals, we are part of a culture, and being part of this culture, we somehow influence. We exert some kind of influence on our culture. And our culture, by its turn, influences us. So it's a two-way street. It's a very dynamic process. At this very moment, we are influencing us. That's a very dynamic process, very hard to be explained. And pay special attention here, guys. Strong literature evidence has shown that cultures influences our values, our beliefs, our behaviors, not exclusively, of course. I have to say not exclusive, of course, because when we write scientific papers, for instance, about culture, some readers and some evaluators, when they read the paper, they say, no, but there are many differences between these two countries: innovation, economy, size, etc. Cross-cultural psychologists, cross-cultural studies, cross-cultural research doesn't claim that culture is the exclusive influence on our behavior, on our attitudes, on our values. We just claim that culture must be acknowledged because it somehow influences us. It somehow exerts some extent of influence on our interpretations, on our attitudes, values, behaviors. So that has to be very clear for everybody, especially from different knowledge fields. Cross-cultural studies are investigating the possible influence of culture on this or that behavior, on this or that attitude, on this or that value, but just part of this whole influence. Okay, this is very important. For us to finalize our presentation of this afternoon, I would like to show you just some examples of scientific papers, recent scientific papers that have investigated the possible influence of culture on a variety of different aspects of our lives. Take a look, guys. Pay special attention to these studies. Take a look at this study here, this scientific paper. The title is The Influence of Culture on Impulsive Buying. Do you understand impulsive buying? Those people who cannot spend any money, but when they see something being advertised, they immediately go there and buy that. They cannot control themselves. And there's a specific cultural dimension that we discussed when I was presenting to you the 6 dimensions proposed by Hofstede, and it was the last one called indulgence. Indulgence means having a hard time, having trouble, having difficulty controlling yourself, controlling your impulses. So this article here is probably investigating the possible influence of culture on impulse buying. So before, I haven't read this article completely. I'm just guessing that I would say that countries that score high on indulgence probably are comprised of individuals who have a hard time with impulse buying, that have more difficulty controlling themselves when it comes to impulse buying. A second study, the influence of culture on attitudes towards humorous advertising. So each one of us, when we watch on TV, for example, an advertising, a humorous advertising, I may deal with that in a different way than you. So this article is possibly investigating the possible influence of culture on how people from different countries react, deal with advertising, with humorous advertising. The influence of culture on Koreans' risk perception. Do you take risks easily, or you have a hard time taking risks? So basically, that's what this article is investigating within the Korean culture, and they are investigating the possible influence of the Korean culture on individuals' risk perception. So I ask you, we are about to finish, guys. We are about to finish. I ask you, this paper, this one that you are seeing here right now, could it be considered a cultural study or a cross-cultural study?
I think it is just cultural study.
That's a cultural study. That's it. Here, they are investigating the possible influence of culture on another thing, on another variable. Which variable is it? Risk perception. But they are doing that within the Korean country. They are not comparing 2 or more countries. So this is a cultural study. Congratulations. The influence of culture on students mathematics achievement across 51 countries. This one is easy. Is it a cross-cultural study or a cultural study?
A cross-cultural study.
Just based on the title, I agree with you. This is a cross-cultural study, not just because it is comparing 2 or more countries, in this case 51, but because the title makes it clear to us that they are investigating the possible influence of culture on how well students go on mathematics. This study is special. This study is amazing. They are investigating the possible influence of culture, of national cultures, on how well students go on mathematics. I know that being a good student in mathematics is influenced by a variety of other variables, but they are investigating the part of this influence that is exerted by culture. That's a very interesting.
André,
The influence, what?
and there is a stamp there, cross mark. So I think I think too it's a cross culture because of the stamp cross mark. Just a
Yes,
joke, okay?
yes, I agree with you. Look at this one, guys. The influence of culture on end-of-life decision making. They are investigating. They are saying, guys, that the culture that we belong to may influence what we do, our behavior when we are about to die, or when people from close to us, relatives of us, they are about to die. That's a very interesting study. They are investigating how culture can influence our behaviors when we are about to die, what we do, what we don't do when we are about to die. Let's say that we have a relative of ours that is about to die, and we, close family, have to make some decisions. These decisions are influenced by the culture. Maybe decisions here in Brazil may be different from decisions in Africa, in Nigeria, depending on the culture. Comparing the same scenario. That's amazing. Materialism and sharing economy, a cultural study of American and Indian consumers. This is a cross-cultural study, right? The title says it's to us. 2 countries are being compared, American and Indians. And if we read the abstract, we will make sure that this is indeed a cross-cultural study because they take into account cultural aspects. But based on the title alone, it would be enough for us to agree that this is a cross-cultural study. So how materialistic people are, it can be influenced by culture. And at last, the last article that I would like to share with you, annual research review, across cultural similarities and differences in parenting. Take a look, guys. Cross-cultural similarities and differences in parenting. The way you and me behave as parents may be influenced by our culture. That's the power of culture. Scientific papers being published in very respected scientific journals are showing the influence of culture in a variety of different things, different behaviors, different values, different beliefs. And this one here is amazing. It is investigating the possible influence of culture on our behavior as parents. It can vary from country to country, right? So, guys, cross-cultural studies and cultural studies also are a knowledge field that really deserve to be deeper investigated. It's amazing how culture, how the environment that we were raised in can influence the way we think, the way we interpret things that happens around us. And we just saw here that there is a lot of opportunities for studies to investigate the possible influence of culture. Guys, thank you very much for your interest, for being part of this event, for participating. And I'm at your disposal in case you have any question or any comment. Okay, I'm going to close here this slide presentation, but I continue here at your disposal for us to talk if you want to make any comment or any question. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Professor André. It was really good to hear you, as always. And I'm gonna begin with two questions, and I'll give space for the others later to, if they have some questions, they can do it too. So my first question here for you, Professor, is about the question, the concept of culture. And I'm gonna read here for you. Is the search for a closed definition or a single definition of culture something to strive? I don't know how to say this word. Strive. And why? And the second one, or I do it later.
Well, let me try to answer your first question. We saw at the beginning of the presentation that there are many different definitions of culture, right? In 1952, 162 definitions were identified. More recently, in 2006, 300 different definitions for culture. Nowadays, probably there are more than 300. And I agree with you that if we had one single concept for culture, or at least fewer concepts, it would be, of course, easier for us to understand culture. It would be easier for different knowledge fields to reach a common understanding about this subject. But I believe that this is impossible because of the complexity of culture. I think that this high number of different definitions for culture is just a natural consequence of the complexity of culture. Sorry, guys. Just a sec. Okay. So I don't know if you follow my understanding. My understanding, guys, is complex things are harder to be explained. And we saw based on the definition brought up by the Edward Tyler, the considered original concept. He says that culture is comprised of a variety of things, right? Knowledge, language, values, behaviors, attitudes, law, norms, etc. So it is indeed a very complex uh, concept. So maybe this high number of different definitions is just a natural consequence. And maybe, I'm not affirming that, but maybe this high number of definitions may be even a good thing because uh, if we have a lot of different definitions, each knowledge field will focus, will emphasize aspects of culture that are more important to that specific knowledge field. For instance, I could say that for sociology, most of their concepts emphasize interaction between people and makes sense. for sociology, sociology is interested in interactions between people. So for sociology, I would say that they pay more attention to the way people interact and share these different interpretations. For administration, for instance, administration is a field that is more focused on organizational culture, how people behave within companies, how people behave in different organizational scenarios. If we think about clinical psychologists, their concepts of culture, they will emphasize aspects related to family culture, because maybe understanding family cultures, it will be easier for them to understand their patients. So I'm just giving random examples here that this high variety of definitions may be a good thing, because it allows different knowledge fields to emphasize different aspects of culture that are more important to them. But achieving just one concept, I think it's almost impossible.
Okay, I see. And the second question may be polemical. It is about immigration. What practical consequences can the discussion of culture have for immigration studies? And I ask this because some countries are more closed to immigration, while others are more open. For example, in Europe, in our present days, some people say that violence and problems within the country are related to, generally, are related to individuals, specifically foreigners. And what do you have to say about this topic and the contribution of culture and the discussion of the culture to immigration studies, please?
Well, I think that immigration and xenophobia, they are topics that can be discussed in light of cultural studies. I agree with you. And the practical consequences are many. When we think about the cultural dimensions proposed by Hofstede, let's think first about power distance. We just saw that power distance is a cultural dimension. In other words, countries that score high on power distance are comprised of individuals who think that inequalities are okay, that inequalities are natural, that inequalities have to be accepted, that a few people must have more privileges than others, that a few people must have more benefits than others. So it would make sense to me, I would say, it would make sense to me that countries that score high on power distance, they would be less open to immigrants, because they think that few people must have more privileges than others. So it would make sense to me that these native citizens, they would believe that they deserve more privileges than immigrants, that they deserve more benefits than immigrants. Okay, so that's just the hypothesis. Of course, it should be empirically tested, but that makes a theoretical sense to me. And we could also talk about masculinity. We saw that masculinity is a cultural dimension that is closely related to competition, right? We saw that countries or cultures that score high on masculinity, they value competition, competitiveness. They value financial success, victories, material success. So think with me. I would say it would make sense to me that countries that score high on masculinity, they would be less open to immigrants also, because they value competition, and immigrants would naturally be considered competitors to them with respect to employment, for instance. Okay, my country has just a few number of job vacancies. So people that come from other countries will be my competitors. And they value that competitiveness, that competition. So you see that when we start thinking about cultural dimensions, it starts to make sense to us. It's easy for us to start hypothesizing which countries would be more or less open to immigrants. But of course, what I just said here are just hypotheses. They would have to to be empirically tested. And as you know, a national culture, it is not created and not transformed overnight. So in order for a country to change the way their native citizens see immigrants, uh, it would take a long time for them to advertise good practices on TV, on the internet, that try to show to the population that immigrants are not their competitors, that they do not have to have less privileges than us native citizens. So it's not something that you watch an advertisement on TV and you change immediately the way you think. No, culture is constructed, is built over years and years. So the government would have to take this responsibility and try to focus on that over the next 20, 30, or even 50 years. And unfortunately, in Brazil, politicians normally don't care about initiatives that take that long. They care about initiatives that have immediate results so that they can be reelected.
Okay, thank you so much again. And I gonna give space for you guys. If anyone has some question to make for Professor André, feel free to do or to make or create. Anyone?
I have one
Okay.
question. Before, I would like to say that about this discussion about the immigrants, I thought Portugal would be more individualist because the xenophobia Brazilians say they suffer when they visit the country. And it's makes sense, right?
Yes, based on recent data, right? They have been showing xenophobia in their daily practices, right? And it's interesting. If I'm not mistaken, Portugal, maybe I'm wrong, but Portugal has a high score on power distance, right? And we just saw that power distance is related to how people think that inequalities are acceptable. So if Portugal is a country that scores high on power distance, it is expected that their native citizens will think that inequalities are something normal. So they will think that it's normal to treat immigrants as people different or that have less privileges than the native speakers, the native citizens. Sorry. So all of the, even though the examples, right, guys, that we discussed here, all focused on individualism, they focus just on one cultural dimension. It's always good also to discuss the six of them together, right? We were talking here about individualism in Portugal. They have a low level of individualism, but if I'm not mistaken, I have to check it out. They have a high score on power distance. Let me just check it out here. Power distance. Portugal has a higher score on power distance than Brazil. Not that higher, but a little higher, right? But anyway, your reasoning, Amanda, makes sense when you think about individualism and when you think about what has been happening recently there in the country. And we have to try to get everything together and try to reflect, consider all points of view, all different cultural aspects.
Thank you, Professor. And just one more question about that Korean study about risk perception. And if the study made explicit that they were studying different groups from Korea, can we say it's a cross subcultural study?
Yes, if they state within the study that each one of those groups are considered within the country a different subculture, I could say that it is a cross-cultural study. Even though, to tell you the truth, when we hear cross-cultural study, we immediately think about comparisons between countries. But a cross-cultural study can be a comparison of more than two or more different groups. It can be regions, subcultures, but I agree with you. If they emphasize and make sure to the reader within the article that these two groups that they are comparing are considered within the country, different subcultures, I could say that this is a cross-cultural study, even though the title itself does not make that clear, right? When we read just the title, it doesn't, it's not clear for the reader that they are comparing two or more groups or two or more subcultures. So based on the title, they lead us to think that it is just a cultural study.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we have 8 more minutes, so maybe we can make 2 questions or one, Professor.
It's up to you. We can exceed a little bit 5 p.m., maybe 5:15 at least. We had to
Okay.
wait a little bit to start, right? We waited at least 5 or 10 minutes to start. It's up to you.
Okay. Anyone else wanna bring to us some more questions or any question for Professor? If we don't have any, I can make one more. Nope. So I'm gonna give this one to you, Professor. Third question. What is the relationship between culture and worldview? Are they synonymous or do they differ in your opinion?
I would say that Cosmo view is not a synonym of culture. Why do I say that? We may have, for instance, two people with the same cosmo view or worldview. Let's talk about the Christian worldview, okay? Just for us to make it easier to understand. We have two people with the same cosmo view, with the same Christian cosmo view, but they belong to different national cultures. One is here in Brazil and the other one is in Europe. And the other way around. I may have someone here in Brazil with a Christian worldview, someone with another worldview, which is not Christian, and they belong to the same Brazilian culture. So you see that these things, they are not, even though they are intimately related, they are not synonyms. I would say that cosmo view or worldview is part of a culture. Do you remember that Edward Tyler said that a culture is comprised of languages, values, attitudes, behaviors, laws, and beliefs? So I would categorize cosmo view as a belief, as part of a culture, because I may have one single culture, one Brazilian culture, and people with different cosmo views. So they are not synonyms, and I would consider that a cosmo view or worldview is part of a culture.
Okay, so in this final moments, I wanna ask you just one more question, and we can finish this webinar. Question number 4. Wouldn't thinking of culture as a program like Hofstede or a pattern like Triandis be somewhat mechanical for a concept that is so dynamic, culture?
When Hofstede says that culture is a collective programming of the mind, and when Triandis says that a culture is a pattern shared of beliefs, a standard shared of beliefs, and so on, I agree with you that that may sound a little bit mechanical, right? Like, like if I came to you and said, "Oh, Luis, let's program our minds to think like this. Let's program our minds to interpret things like this." But I believe that what they meant is that when they say programming or standard or pattern, they are just emphasizing what is typical, right? Metaphorically, it happens as if all members of a culture were programmed to think and to interpret things around them the same way. But they mean just what is typical. So we tend to think like this, but not necessarily we will think. It's like we are programmed to be collectivist, but I may not be collectivist. Okay. So I think that even though it sounds like something mechanical, it's subconscious. And it's not only subconscious, it is just emphasizing what is typical in a society.
Okay, I think that I'm gonna finish here. I have a lot of questions, so I can ask you later and we can talk a little bit more.
Sure.
And I'm gonna pass for you the word so you can, as the coordinator of our extension group, make the or bring the last words for everyone that are here,
Okay.
our farewell moment.
Mhm.
So it's
Okay.
up to you. And thank you again for the words and the lecture.
Thank you. I think that we have just a few seconds. I'm going to be very fast. Thank you very much, Luis, for moderating this meeting. Your great questions. Thank you very much for your support to this project. Thank you very much, guys, for participating. I hope that you have been exposed to the English language. As I said, it's always good for us to expose ourselves to the English language. That's how we absorb it more easily. Thank you very much for participating in. The next webinar will be announced soon, so you will get the notifications. Thank you very much for everything and have you all a great weekend. Bye bye, guys.